Hi everyone, Gene Richards here, attorney from the Williams Law Group, back on the Navigating DCP&P podcast, the podcast where we break down complex issues involving the division of child protection and permanency. On today's episode, we're going to discuss domestic violence allegations in DCP&P cases. How do they impact DCP&P cases? How do they initiate DCP&P cases? And how do DCP&P cases affect DV matters? Before I get into that discussion, I want to remind you all listening that any information that I share in this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship, but our office does welcome any person involved with DCP&P to contact our office for a confidential consultation with our team. So why do domestic violence allegations matter to DCP&P? First of all, as you might imagine, if there are domestic violence allegations in the home and there are children in the home, those children may witness the events, they may hear the events, they may be impacted directly by the events. Exposure to domestic violence may equal neglect. Even if a child is not physically harmed, merely witnessing domestic violence can be considered neglect under state law. So you may think it was between myself and my boyfriend or my spouse or somebody else, and my child wasn't part of the allegation, part of the incident in question. But if a child is in the home, your child may hear, may see, may be impacted by that event. And so even if your child isn't harmed during a domestic violence allegation or incident, that may and will most likely be sufficient for DCP&P to be involved. In fact, if there is a call to the police, if there is an allegation of a domestic violence incident in the home and you have children, then DCP&P is supposed to be called by the police to inform them of that domestic violence allegation or incident, or the reason why the police were called in the first place. And so merely having a child in the home during a domestic violence incident or allegation should and most likely will be sufficient enough to have DCP&P involved, because being home, being around those events, exposure to those events may be deemed to be neglectful. Also, in a domestic violence situation, both parents may be affected, whether you are the alleged victim or the alleged perpetrator, or there are allegations against both parents as being an alleged perpetrator and or victim. The alleged perpetrator may face restrictions or possible removal. The victim, the alleged victim, may face scrutiny or allegations of a failure to protect, of choosing the parent, the spouse, over the children. Now, obviously, notwithstanding the restraining order process itself, because as you already may know, when you are served with a temporary restraining order, typically, if you have a child or children, that TRO may already bar contact, may already bar parenting time, and you may have to request that under the restraining order case. But notwithstanding that, DCP&P still may try to put restrictions on parenting time based on a restraining order or allegations of domestic violence, or may even request or attempt to remove a child from your care based on allegations of domestic violence. And to be very clear, these are allegations, right? Not saying that something actually did happen. In fact, say for example, there was a call to the police for whatever reason for alleged domestic violence, but there was never a restraining order requested or granted. Or maybe there was a temporary restraining order in place, but that was dismissed or withdrawn. That will not by itself mean DCP&P is not concerned. So just because there's no open TRO or FRO or any allegations in family court under the domestic violence docket, that's not enough to have DCP&P guaranteed to be out of your case. I have many cases where calls have come in, there are no restraining orders, perhaps, or it was withdrawn or dismissed or what have you, and DCP&P is involved, or they were involved still, and they were still concerned. I've even had cases where there are no restraining orders, but removal still happened, right? DCP&P may think that, as I mentioned, not only are they concerned about the alleged perpetrator, but also the alleged victim, or they believe that both parents are alleged perpetrators, and so based on the domestic violence in the home, that child is in imminent risk of harm and should be removed from the parent's care. And so it can happen a number of different ways. Again, one, the alleged perpetrator is a danger. Two, both parents are alleged perpetrators and therefore a danger to the child. or also the parent who's alleged victim is unable or has failed to protect the children. And therefore, even the victim may be a target of a DCP&P investigation. And so there may be requests to have different services like a DV liaison to advise the victim of how to best address this. Maybe counseling, DV counseling. There is intervention for the individual who is the alleged perpetrator, different services to try and alleviate the concerns of DCP&P and domestic violence in the home. And we'll get to that a little more thoroughly later on in this episode. And of course, schools, hospitals, and I mentioned police that suspect domestic violence when children are involved are going to call DCP&P. And so whether or not there's a restraining order, DCP&P, if there are DV concerns and calls being made to the police, they will be involved. And so what challenges do families face when there are domestic violence allegations in DCP&P cases? Well, again, under the domestic violence doc, you may already have issues of suspended parenting time, protective orders, custody situations. But if there is no restraining order case, those parameters still may occur under the DCP&P docket, or as we mentioned in last week's episode, a safety protection plan. Courts may limit visitation, remove a parent from the home, put supervision in place. That happens in cases like this. Even the victims may be penalized. Victims of abuse can be blamed if the agency feels that that victim or alleged victim did not act quickly enough to protect the child. Is this parent choosing an abusive spouse, abusive significant other over their children? And based on that mindset, that lack of judgment, is that parent now putting the children at risk of harm? Children are in the middle of these cases, right? Emotional trauma from witnessing conflict can weigh heavily in a court's decision. If these kids are seeing the yelling, the language, um, the verbal abuse, not just physical, of course, that's a major concern as well. But yeah, people come and say, well, it never got physical, so it's not a big deal. Well, hearing screaming and shouting and name calling and belittling, harassment, that kind of behavior, those conversations, those words being used, kids see that, they witness that, and that can cause trauma and neglect. And so it's important to realize that although you may think, oh, well, it's not a big deal, people argue, people have disagreements. Well, think about your children and what they're witnessing and the impact it has on them, because that's what DCP&P and the court are going to do. They're not worried about how you think or how you feel in that sense. They're worried about how is behavior impacting the kids. And they're in the middle of these disagreements and these conversations. And so it's important to remember that. Now, of course, the system is flawed. I mean, in many ways. I won't get into too much depth of DV cases, but the burden of proof for a temporary restraining order is quite low, and they're granted almost every time. And in those situations, allegations are made that may be completely false, but a court, out of precaution, grants a TRO, has a parent kicked out of the home, has no parenting time, without even having that parent's voice be heard. And so, unfortunately, with a one-sided story, oftentimes parents are removed from a home by the domestic violence matter without even being heard by the court. And so it's flawed because a parent can be upset at somebody else and just wants them out of the house. That's a way to make it happen. And so that's a huge issue in DV cases specifically. But again, that removal and that DV involvement by itself triggers DCP&P being involved. And so although that's perhaps more of a flaw for restraining order hearings because that involves DCP&P, it becomes an issue in the DCP&P case as well. I have a case where I have a client who, her and the other individual, the spouse, aren't getting along. Nothing that's, in my opinion, domestic violence, but they are upset at each other and they don't get along very well. And in that situation, dad files for a TRO, really making things up and exaggerating, and mom's, because of that TRO, is out of the house at a motel, staying, just trying to have a roof over her head. The case was pending when DCP&P got involved still. And based on that restraining order in the DCP&P case, mom was out of the home still. but she was granted parenting time under the DCP&P case, so things were moving along. But because of the restraining order and that restriction under the DV case, that impacted directly the DCP&P case. Because there's a TRO in place, the judge basically said, oh, well, TRO is still in place, therefore, under that case, mom can't be in the home, and so with DCP&P, she wasn't in the home either. She can't be contradicting case by case. And so a restraining order has a direct impact on a DCP&P case. And in fact, once the restraining order got dismissed, she was back in the home. So that directly impacted the DCP&P case because DCP themselves didn't want to have mom be supervised or mom be out of the home, which is what was happening. But because the restraining order was in place, that kind of tied their hands up and the judge's hands up where she was saying that, well, she's out of the home because of a DV case, and therefore DCP&P, even though they may have been agreeable to mom being back in the home, that restraining order prevented it at the time. But again, once it was dismissed, she's back in the home, and that case actually with DCP&P got dismissed shortly thereafter. So that's the issue. Even when DCP&P perhaps doesn't want to be that involved or for very long, restraining order being in place may delay DCP&P's case. So it has a direct impact on DCP&P matters, both the allegations and the actual restraining orders being in place. So I see it all the time where call is made, nothing is filed, there's no restraining order being filed because a call is made to the police. That triggers DCP&P right away. I have a case where, just to show you how kind of things get out of hand rather quickly, I had a case where there was an older child upstairs in the home, and mom and dad were arguing downstairs, but they were speaking loudly. And the child who was older, again, a late teen, I think 16, 17 years old, if not even older than that, um, heard the arguing and got concerned. And so she calls the police because she's wondering what's going on down there. I don't want to go down myself. Who's even down? Just hearing loud voices. And was afraid. And those things happen and understandable. And so this child calls the police, and there weren't really any major concerns. There was a TRO filed because the one party felt pressured by the police to do so, but that was dismissed and thrown out within a few days. But that child calls the police. There's a child there. The police called DCP&P, even though there was no restraining order in place for very long anyway. Everyone kind of basically took back what they said. It was just a misunderstanding. Emotions got high and things were perhaps exaggerated, even though everything was not what it seems, because DCP&P was called by the police. When the police saw a child in the home and they were called for a DV situation, that created a whole DCP&P investigation. Now, again, in this case, it's pretty open and shut. There was an explanation as to what happened. DCP&P did their due diligence and talked to the parents and everything like that. So that wasn't a very long case, but that call to the police and there being a DV concern triggered a DCP&P investigation. So it's important to provide clarity to DCP&P as soon as you can. Explain what happened, why there need not be any concerns for a long-winded investigation, and you want to comply to a degree, right? Again, when DCP&P is involved, they want to check their boxes, talk to the parents, talk to the kids, and the longer you wait to explain your situation, your side of the story, the more time there is to have DCP&P make up their own narrative, and they're not going to close a case out without you telling them what happened. And if they were to do that, it wouldn't end very well for you anyway. And so it's important to jump in, talk to the worker, have a lawyer present with you if you need to. As in this case, I ended up going to the meeting with DCP&P at their office. We discussed with them the concerns or lack thereof. And once we met with DCP&P, they understood nothing major happened here, and they're going to close their case out rather quickly. It's important to have somebody on your side, and really with us, because we're so close, but we know, I personally know, I feel like most of the DAGs in New Jersey, and I've been to the offices and meetings with them, and so they're aware of our office and who we are. And that speaks volumes. They know that we come with a no-nonsense approach and that we tell them tell them like it is, what needs to happen next. And because we have that reputation for dealing with DCP&P all the time in these kind of cases, they respect our opinion and what we think should happen next. So in this case, we explain what happened, explain what we're willing to do, and that was it. And that was agreeable. And so it was a mutual respect in that sense. And so it's important to have somebody on your side who knows how to handle not just DCP&P cases, but also DV cases as they intertwine with DCP&P cases. You want to have somebody who has knowledge in both. And so finding someone who just knows DV cases or just restraining orders, that's great to help you out with the restraining order. But if you have a child or children, you're going to have DCP&P involved. It's important to have somebody handling that case that knows DCP&P also and knows them well. As always, I want to thank you all for listening, for tuning in to this episode. We discussed, of course, DV cases, how they impact or trigger DCP&P cases. It's important to mention for those listening that there are supports and resources out there. DV hotlines, counseling. If you need help, please reach out. Get the help you need. From the DV hotline, from counseling, the safety of you and your children come first. Do not let the fear of having DCP&P involved prevent you from getting the protection and help you need. Please subscribe to our channel, share this episode and episodes of the past just so people can obtain knowledge they need with DCP&P cases. And we have resources and support on our website, on our social media pages, and it'll allow you to figure out and hear about next episodes and want to tune in again, as we'll be discussing next week about medical neglect allegations. So there's so many different allegations, right? Abuse, neglect, types of abuse, types of neglect we discussed weeks ago. And we're going to kind of hone in on what are medical neglect allegations, how to address them, how to prevent them, how to deal with them once DCP gets involved. So until next time, have a great week and we will talk to you then.